Hi, and welcome to another edition of Master Your Fishing. You join me here today at Holbar at the lovely Partridge Lakes Fishery, where we'll be going through the finer details of feeder fishing, and hopefully we'll be catching plenty of these. One of the areas that I find with feeder fishing where people struggle with is deciding what bait to be using with the feeder. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the various baits that we use in conjunction with commercial style feeder fishing. Now, the thing to remember, I'm going to take you back to sort of school really, is with the components we actually use or the baits that we use, they're all ultimately made from the same thing, whether it be a micro pellet, a ground bait, an 8mm, a 10mm, 11mm pellet. Ultimately, it all comes down to fish meal, and it's just branded in slightly different sizes, shapes and smells, etc. So what I'm saying is a ground bait is the same as a micro pellet, and that's the same as a big pellet. So why would we use it in different situations? Well, because say with ground bait, it's far more finer than a micro pellet and a micro pellet than a big pellet. What that gives it is much more attractive properties, and it all comes down to, in my opinion, surface area. We all remember sitting in school being told the finer a substance is, a quicker a chemical reaction will occur. Well, it's very similar with this, that because it's got a greater surface area per volume, you're going to be getting more attractiveness to the fish. So that's basically the rule of thumb that I use, is basically the finer the bait that you're using, the quicker it's going to release its attractants into the water and attract some fish into the area. So because of these different properties, it means that the bait's going to behave in a slightly different way. A ground bait, for example, is going to be brilliant at attracting everything into your peg and starting to feed, but what it does mean is everything will feed on it and it will spread really quickly in your swim. So that to me means that it's basically it's a bait that I use initially to attract some fish into the peg, or if I'm fishing in very shallow water, which then starts to narrow down the sort of situations where you're going to use that bait in. Pellets, for example, they're going to be more attractive than a bigger pellet, but they're going to wash around the peg far less and are more suitable for keeping a tighter feed area and in slightly deeper water. So then you can start to sort of work out the situations when you're going to use micro pellets. And then when we start getting onto big pellets, these can only be fed into your peg with either a bomb and bag or with a catapult. And these are great for making noise into your swim and attracting fish via noise rather than the attractants leaking out. So these, generally speaking, bigger pellets be used with deep water and straight lead fishing. So with understanding what ground bait's actually doing, you can then start to tailor it to what feeder you're going to be using. Now to me, ground bait is limited purely on commercial style waters to either a cage feeder or a method feeder. A cage feeder is something that I would use to get a big volume of this into your peg as a quick hit to attract some fish, or if we're fishing longer hook lengths, for skimmers, for bream, for silverfish, etc. Because a method feeder doesn't really lend itself to that style of fishing. A nice cage feeder will release some bait on the drop and work in conjunction with a long hook length and allow some fish to be caught on the drop, etc. A method feeder will keep a nice compact tight bit of bait that you can get into some shallow water to the far bank of a commercial, and that'll be more to target carp and F1s. So with a method feeder, the way the bait's presented on these is that it creates a bit of a dinner table in order for the fish to feed over, which is a little bit less focused than a pellet feeder. So if you see, once that's in the swim and that's breaking down, it's going to create a bit of an area like that for fish to graze upon. Whereas a pellet feeder will be far more focused, which I'll show you in a second. And that to me is brilliant presentation for carp and F1s in shallow water on the far bank. Once you move on to micro pellets, again, micro pellets can be used with both method feeders and pellet feeders. And this is when you need to start thinking about what you're trying to achieve on the day. Like I said, with a method feeder, it creates a bigger area. With pellet feeders, the reason we use them is, like I said, it creates a far more focused area in front of the feeder where it's more congregated in and around your hook length. So for me, pellet feeders are perfect for days when bites are at a premium and you're trying to maximise your bite potential by feeding smaller amounts of bait. Because the same size method feeder with micro pellets is going to create a larger surface area, which is great when there's more fish in your peg, but when bites are at a premium, you want to keep that as tight as possible and maximise your bite potential. The other thing with a pellet feeder is, due to the actual casing going like around the full perimeter of the feeder, it means the pellets are more protected as it's falling through the water, which means it's more likely to get to the bottom. So for me, a pellet feeder is a far better way of introducing bait or micro pellets into your peg if you've got slightly deeper water. So say 3 foot and above, I'd always go for a pellet feeder, because it's more likely to get to the bottom and deliver that nice tight parcel of bait around your hook bait that you're looking for optimum bites. Now the other thing we can do is actually mix those two properties together, which is something that I've done today, of mixing micro pellets in with ground bait. And I've done that today initially just to get some fish into the peg, because again, like I said, ground bait is far more attractive than micro pellets. So I want to use that initial quality to get some fish feeding in the swim, and then I can cut it back if required to just using pellets around the method feeder, just so we keep that bait from spreading too much and just maximising the amount of bites that we're going to get from the session. When you start moving into larger pellets, like I said, these are far less attractive to fish, but on its day it's still unbeatable, because a larger pellet will be more selective, so it means you're going to come back with a better fish each time you get a bite. But also what bigger pellets allow you to do is to loose feed with a catapult over the top, and so what they lack in terms of attractiveness as a bait on the bottom, they more than make up for by the noise of that bait entering the water, so the fish can home in on it. And like I said, it's only ever going to be a better sized fish, because the bigger the pellet, the less fish in the lake are going to have a chance to eat it other than the biggest fish. It's all about tailoring the size bait to the fish that you're trying to catch from the peg. And once you understand the various properties of the bait, it makes your feeder selection and your method selection far simpler. Okay, so we've gone through the baits. Now let's have a look at the sort of swim that I've selected today to show you why I've decided upon the approach that I have. So as you can see, we've got a swim which gives us lots and lots of options here. We've got a far bank island straight in front of us. We've got a central channel, and we've got a nice reed bed opposite another island over there to the right hand side. I've had a plumb up, and it's nice and shallow next to the island. It's dead shallow in between the two islands. And we've got deep water this side of us, which basically gives us all the options that we could ever possibly want to target the fish. So what I've decided upon today, we're in September. Everything in the lake this time of year wants to feed. It's one of the best times of year for catching all species, be it carp, skimmers, roach. It's like the golden time for me when I love being on the bank. But what that does mean is everything's hungry. So although I'm going to initially start on a method feeder over to the island in the shallow water just to catch a couple of quick fish, I feel as though lots of noise and lots of bait going in is going to be the way forward for us to catch today, because if we're only putting in small amounts, I just feel with the amount of silverfish in this lake, there won't be any bait left on the bottom to actually bring in some better fish that ultimately I'm going to be targeting here today. We're going to start off by a method feeder, casting dead tight into the shallow water. I'm going to mix ground bait in with micro pellets just to give that attractiveness that I was talking about, to get a few quick bites. All the while I'm going to be feeding some pellets over towards the sort of channel and reeds to my right there. They're going to be going in constantly to attract those fish into the area. They're going to be selective, so I'm only going to get carp, better skimmers and F1s feeding on them, and I'm going to chuck over the top either a pellet feeder, a method feeder or a straight lead, depending on what I feel is going to be better on the day. Sometimes it can pay dividends to chuck a method feeder over the top of hard pellets, just because it gives a focused, attractive point for the fish to home in on. Other times you're best off just matching the hatch and chucking a straight lead with a hard pellet on, just matching exactly what you're fishing. Depends on how the fish are feeding on the day. If they're moving from bait to bait to bait, that's perfect time for a bomb and pellet approach, because they'll hook themselves. So yeah, that's the methods that I've decided upon based upon the swim that I'm faced with today. Okay, now we've decided the method that we're going to use on this swim, let's go through the tackle. So I've decided upon the new Reactor Core mini feeder rod. It's 10'6" and it's a progression on the original XZ65s, which are great rods. These are slightly improved. They've got a bit more of a stiffer action further down the blank, which basically aids with casting accuracy. And it's perfect for the distance that we're fishing. Anywhere sort of 30 to 50 yards, this was my rod of choice. Once you start looking at longer distances, then bigger, more powerful rods are required. But in this instance, this is perfect. It's got a lovely soft action for playing the fish under your feet. It's everything that I need from a method rod, really. Coupled that with a GFD 4000 reel. Again, that's the right sort of size reel for this type of fishing at that distance. Again, bigger distances, longer casting will benefit from a larger spool reel, but for most of commercial fishing, a 4000 size is spot on. In terms of main line, I've gone all around the houses with lines, and with method feeder fishing or feeder fishing for carp in general, what you want is a robust, strong 8 to 10 pound line. Something with not a huge amount of stretch in it, which will aid with accuracy when you're stopping the feeder mid-flight. That stretch sometimes allows the feeder to sort of spring back on itself, and it's just not right. You want a nice, robust, strong, powerful line, and it makes no difference to the fishing. The only time you'd look to scale down potentially is in a really bad wind and you're trying to get the line to sink as quickly as possible. But again, for 90% of your fishing, keep it simple, stick to a robust 8 to 10 pound line. In terms of the feeder, I've gone for a simple 20 gram gripper small method feeder. For the size fish and the distance we're casting, that's the perfect choice. You don't want anything too big, it'll be making too big a splash on the entry. And I'm not looking to put loads and loads of bait out initially. I just want a quick hit and a quick bite. And that sort of size feeder is perfect for that. That's simply an inline feeder for fish safety, and that's threaded onto the line. Now, it's very important, in my opinion, with your method rigs to have this hinge point here, which is created by having one of the quick feeder beads. Now, the reason for that hinge is if it was a loop-to-loop connection, A, you'd have nothing for the feeder to rest against during casting, but B, it'd create rigidity in that rig. Instead of having that hinge, it'd tend to push the hook bait away from your pile of micro pellets or ground bait once it's broken down in the water. So having that hinge point in the rig is really important for your hook bait presentation when it comes to method feeder fishing. Like I said, if you can imagine that pile in there, without that hinge, the hook length would be stiffer and would end up being pushed away from your free offerings. So always make sure you've got a bead in place to create that hinge and have something for the feeder to cast against. Yeah. So hook lengths wise, I've gone for an 020 to a size 12 QC1 hook. I've actually used the ready tied ones because it's everything that I need and saves me the hassle of tying them up. But again, 020, I've played around for years with using finer hook lengths on method feeder fishing. The strong, like an 020 is fine. You don't need any finer than that. It's not going to get you any more bites. You just want something that's robust, resilient, and won't let you down. So with a hook, you want looking for a nice big, strong, reliable hook. And like I said, I've gone for the QC one with the offset points, just to give me more hookups basically. So hook bait wise, again over the years I've tried lots of different things, dead maggots, pellets and the like. I've settled with wafters for most of my fishing. Now the idea of that is, I've not had to on this rig, but what you're trying to do is create a neutrally buoyant hook bait. Because if you had anything that was heavy in amongst a pile of micro pellets or ground bait, they are very light in the water, and the fish will come in and they know how much suction to get that bait from the lake bed into their mouth. So if you had something that was heavier than ground bait or micro pellets in and around that feeder, the likelihood is that a carp could come in, remove all your loose offerings from around the feeder and leave your hook bait in place, just simply because it hasn't been able to suck it up basically. So a wafter, that allows you, because it's floating, it allows you to critically balance your hook bait, so it's as light as possible. And obviously a wafter's quite a big surface area as well, which aids in what we're trying to achieve there. So basically what you're trying to do is have a hook bait that can be sucked up with as minimal effort as possible, and it's more likely to be picked up, because 9 times out of 10, in my opinion, like that amount of bait that's in and around the feeder, you can imagine once that's broken down, that isn't much more than a mouthful to a fish, and it's likely that they come in and suck that up with two gulps at the most. And like I said, if you've got a heavy hook bait, there's a high chance that that's going to be left behind and you're just sat there with a method feeder and a single hook bait, which is far less likely to be eaten by any fish. So that's the idea of that, is always to make sure that your hook bait is as neutrally buoyant as possible to aid with being sucked up with your loose bait. Okay, so the last thing to look at is loading up the method feeder. Now, everyone's aware of method molds. They've made loading up the method feeder easy for everybody, perfect and consistent every time. I don't need to go over that. The thing I just want to point out is when you're using a large hook bait, such as a wafter, you need to position it in your mold in the right place. Now you see you've got bars on the method feeder. The gripper ones have got a large section that's opened up here. That's where the hook bait and the hook needs to be placed. If it was higher up the method feeder, there's a chance that when you squeeze it with the mould, you're going to compress the hook bait in between the bars, and the fish aren't going to be able to basically suck the bait up and get hooked. So just be careful and think about where you're placing the hook bait in the mould. Just get that more comfortable. So it's about 3/4 of the way up the method feeder, so I make sure that hook bait's like smack bang over the top of where that opening is going to be, and then it's just a case of loading it up. And as you can see, you can just about make the hook bait 1/3 of the way up the method feeder, which is smack bang on that opening, That means your hook bait or hook won't get caught by those bars, which is perfect presentation every time. All right, give that a go. Okay, so another thing that I've had to go back on, as well as the offset hooks, which I remember for quite a few years I've told people I'd never use, and I now do, is the use of these flavourings. I've always been one that's poo-pooed flavourings, etc. It's one of those with me. I just thought presentation and using the right bait in the right place would far exceed anything you can do with flavouring. But the amount of times that I've actually started using this plasma from Adrenaline and used it to either put on my hook bait to make it stand out as a change later in the match, or put onto a method feeder, and I've had instant results every time. So it's something that I'm starting to bring into my fishing now, is to use flavourings in the right way as either a change bait to evoke a reaction later on in a match, or something to make a hook bait, or in the case of a method feeder, you can make your whole method feeder stand out. You only need a tiny little amount squeezed onto the top, and trust me, that will get you a bite. It's happened too many times to be coincidence now, and like I said, it's something that I've done a U-turn on, and I'm bringing it into my own fishing. And there we go, bite straight away. It's only a skimmer or a small fish, but previous chuck without the addition of the plasma never had a bite, and this went round within 30 seconds again. And it's going to do me in the lilies if I'm not careful. It's definitely not a skimmer, that. No, F1. Bites on the plasma, I don't think there's any coincidence. All right, so yeah, like I said earlier, we're using the new reactor core rod. Like I said, the previous XZ65 was an absolutely brilliant rod, but it was a touch too soft, almost to a fault, where it was a bit softer in the blank further down to get the perfect accuracy. You need a bit of stiffness in the rod, sort of a third of the way down, in order to get your casting accuracy. And this is where this one's improved. It's still got a lovely soft tip action, but stiffens up a little bit quicker, just so you're far more accurate with your casting. Your micro pellets and ground bait need to be mixed to the right consistency to be used on either a pellet feeder or a method feeder. So they squeeze together right, hold on to the feeder, but they're not too wet so they're falling off. So once you've got that consistency right, it's important to use a container that locks in the moisture. These are the ones I use, they're perfect. When the bait's not in use, you can shut the lid down, zip them up, and that bait stays exactly the same sort of dampness that you need in order to facilitate your fishing. So make sure you're using something that seals in the moisture to your bait. So we're moving on to the pellet feeder now, and it's absolutely identical to my method setup. I've got the same 10'6" rod, 4000 reel, 10 pound M-Tech line, the wedge feeder threaded onto the line, in line again for fish safety. And again, the same feeder bead for that pivot point, because we don't want the hook bait kicking away from the feeder too far. And loading up's actually simpler. You don't need the method mould. It's just a case of packing your pellets so it's full, level with the front of the plastic, placing your hook bait in the front, then a small covering just to enclose it in. You don't need to pack it in too hard. and that'll cast out and get to the bottom. No issues at all with any of the bait coming out of the feeder. That's good to go, and it's as simple as that. So another type of feeder available is the sawn-off shotgun, and this is unique to Middy. On the face value, it's a similar sort of design to the wedge pellet feeder, but by having the spring-loaded mechanism at the back, what this allows us to do is use different baits not normally associated with pellet feeder or method feeder type presentation, but providing the same end product. And that's because, generally speaking, the reason other baits aren't used is that they don't bind together and they don't swell on impact with water, which is why method feeders and pellet feeders work, because ground bait and micro pellets both have action in the water. They swell slightly, and that allows it to either fall out the feeder or disperse away from the method feeder. So as you can see, all we need to do is pack the maggots into the back of the feeder, the hook bait goes in, and then the front can be plugged with ground bait, and when that hits the water, that ground bait will react, fall away, and then the mechanism will push everything forward, and you've got a unique presentation which isn't available with any type of feeder. I recommend giving that a go. Different type baits may just be the edge that you're after in your next match or on your fishery, that they don't normally get fished for at range at the same sort of position that we do with pellets and method feeders. So we mentioned bomb fishing earlier. I'm just going to quickly run you through my setup. Again, rod is the 10'6" reactor core, size 4000 reel, 10 pound M-Tech mainline, and then inline bomb. So I'm looking for like a ½ ounce, 3/4 of an ounce, depending on the distance, but that's roughly about the size that's right for where you can actually feed your pellets, which is generally up to like 30 meters. Now, a lot of people fish the inline leads. I've gone away from this slightly. I've gone for the more traditional lead that's attached at the top end. The reason for this is a lot of the time when you're fishing the straight lead, you're fishing into silt, and I don't want the line to be embedded into the silt. I want the lead, if that's going to go in slightly, to still have the line above it. So that's just to counteract any soft bottom that you're fishing over against. Now, I mentioned earlier with the method feeder about having the feeder bead to have that pivot. That's the last thing that you want on the straight lead. So I've gone for a traditional loop-to-loop connection, which you can see there. And that's the opposite of the reason of having the feeder bead on the method, that I want to create rigidity in the rig. Because what I'm trying to do is have a straight line between my hook bait and my lead when it's on the bottom. Now the reason for that is when a carp comes in and sucks a hook bait up, the second he starts to rise off the bottom, it's got a chance of hooking itself, whereas if the hook pellet was sort of like 3-4 inches away from the lead and you had that bow in the line, it's got to lift off and start swimming away before you've got a chance of hooking itself. So that's why you want the rigidity in the line to help kick it away from the lead. And I also, just after casting out, after it's all settled, I will dislodge the lead slightly and wind it in just to create, bring up any of that slack line. So I've got a nice straight line between the lead and the hook bait at all times. And that's just to make sure that I hook more fish. In terms of hooks for straight lead fishing, you want a nice, big, robust, strong hook. And I've gone for a size 10. Again, I've been all around the houses, we're trying smaller hooks, etc., to see whether you get more bites. The bigger the hook, the more hookups you're going to get. It's as simple as that. So couple that with a size 10, QC1, 020, that's about right for me. Something strong, robust, won't let you down, and will hook as many fish as possible. So that's my straight lead setup. One last tip that I've got for you is to take a selection of pellets around with you, or hook baits. So this sort of serves all of my fishing, from pole fishing to straight lead fishing. I just chuck a few different types of coppins and screttings pellets in, with different colours as well, and a nice sealable container that won't let them get wet because they need to stay dry. The amount of times a change hook bait will get you a bite as like a standout hook bait. It's always worth carrying around with you. So a bit of an update on the day. I started on the method feeder straight in front. That was where I just fed micro pellets and ground bait. Had a couple of early fish, a couple of F1s, a couple of nice carp. But as expected, the area over to the right hand side towards the reeds where I'd been feeding some pellets, very quickly the reeds started knocking. So I've chucked a straight lead, had a few fish, a few carp, again a few F1s. But after a few fish, it became apparent that I needed to chuck dead tight into the reeds to get a bite, which meant the method feeder was more productive than the straight lead, just because it allowed a little parcel of bait really tight to the reeds to actually attract a couple of fish in. So I changed over to just chucking the method feeder tight into the reeds, carried on loose feeding pellets, and that's been the best way to attack this peg today. It's not been absolutely solid with fish. We get little runs of fish where they come in, they get a few bites, and then they disappear again, but that's sort of a reflection on the lake we're on. It's not super stocked here at Holbar, but when you do get a bite, they're normally really nice stamped fish. Well, there's a lovely fish to end the day on. Feeder fishing has many different aspects, and as long as you tailor your feeder choice to the baits that you're using to suit the peg that you've fished on the day, you too can be out on the bank catching beautiful fish like these. Thanks for watching. That's a cracking net of fish on the feeder.